Welcome students to lesson 1 of the natural hazards topic. In this lesson we're going to be exploring what a natural hazard is and what we mean when we say a person is at risk of a natural hazard. Throughout this topic we're going to be looking at how natural hazards threaten people around the world and what they can do to reduce the risk of being affected by natural hazards such as earthquakes, volcanoes and storms. Please write the date, title and learning objective and have a pen and paper ready to learn. Time to review prior learning. Write 1 to 10, answer the questions from memory and then mark your answers. Game time. 1. It's the focus. 2. Seismic waves. 3. A pyroclastic flow. 4. Mount St. Helens. 5. The tertiary sector, for example retail, working in shops or office jobs. 6. Foxconn. 7. Low air pressure. We will explore that idea further in this topic. 8. Latitude. 9. Altitude. 10. Seismometer. Please give yourselves a mark out of 10. If you got 8 or more, fantastic. Any questions you got wrong, test yourselves on them repeatedly until you know them by heart. To introduce this topic and this lesson, I'm going to show you a picture and I'm going to get you to think about the idea of a hazard. So here's the picture. What is a hazard? A hazard is a danger. It's something that can cause harm to people or to their property. For example, homes or vehicles or farms or forests that we own. Take a moment to think about what hazards you might encounter in a typical kitchen such as this one. Write them down. So you may have got things such as sharp knives, hot ovens, boiling water in a kettle. You may have got slippery floors or food on the floor which makes the floor slippery, other chemicals. These are the typical hazards, the things that can cause harm in your kitchen. And so when we say a natural hazard, we're talking about a hazard, something that can cause harm, that is not man-made, but rather it is naturally occurring. For instance, looking at these photos and using your own knowledge, write as many natural hazards as you can think of. Well, you should have come up with probably at least 5 of them. You may have said earthquakes, volcanoes, tropical storms, also known as hurricanes, typhoons and cyclones. You may have said tsunamis or landslides. You may even have said more rare ones such as tornadoes or asteroids. These are all natural hazards. They can cause harm to people and their property, such as roads and ships and cars and buildings. And they can also cause damage to people, death and destruction. These are the world's natural hazards. So, write the phrase and its definition, please. Let's do a little check to see if you understand this idea. I'm going to show you some questions, or rather some statements, and you have to say yes, it is a natural hazard, or no, it isn't. So number 1, an earthquake happened in Japan in 2011. It killed 16,000 people and destroyed hundreds of buildings. Was that a natural hazard? You should have said yes, it was. 2, a chemical factory exploded in China in 2015. It killed 179 people and burned down 3 buildings. You should have said no, that's a man-made disaster because it's a chemical factory. 3, a volcano erupted in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It released a lot of ash and harmful gases. No one was killed or affected. You should have said no, because although it's a natural event, it's not a hazard, because no one was affected. 4, a volcano erupted in Iceland in 2010. No one was killed, but air travel was negatively affected. Flights were cancelled. You should have said yes, because a natural hazard doesn't just kill people, it also causes harm, for example, through costing people money. 5, a heat wave affected the UK in 2015. No one was hurt, but some trees in a small forest without any people or buildings were set on fire. That's not a natural hazard for the same reason that number 3 isn't a natural hazard. So now you should have a better understanding of what we mean by a natural hazard. Let's take the next step. What is hazard risk? Look at this kitchen again. Imagine there's a banana peel on the floor, and you and your grandmother walk into the kitchen at different times. Who has a better chance of being hurt by the banana peel on the floor, you or your grandmother, and why? Well, you should have said it's your grandmother that has a greater chance of being hurt, partly because she's maybe more frail, or may walk slower, or may have less good eyesight, or may have weaker muscles, so she's less able to react if she slips. And consequently, the risk of that hazard, the banana peel on the floor, hurting your grandmother is greater than the risk of the hazard hurting you. Hazard risk is, therefore, the chance of people being affected by a natural hazard. And so, we have to think about the chance of being affected by a hazard in the kitchen. If you turn the lights off, you're more likely to be affected by things such as slippery objects on the floor or sharp knives. These affect your hazard risk in a kitchen. But what about in the real world? Well, there are 3 main factors. We call them factors because they are reasons that explain why some people are more at risk of natural hazards than others. Let's explore them. I'm going to show you 2 types of building. On the left, you have a specialized office building in Japan, and on the right, you have a hillside with homes in Haiti, an island in the Caribbean in the west of the Atlantic Ocean. Japan is a HIC, one of the richest countries in the world. Haiti is a LIC, one of the poorest countries in the world. Japan has used its great wealth to invest in technologies and in building design that allows it to construct buildings that are resistant to earthquakes. Both these countries experience earthquakes fairly regularly. In 2011, a major earthquake hit Japan, killing thousands of people. In 2010, the year before, a similarly strong earthquake hit Haiti, but killed more than 10 times more people. This building in Japan has special metal cables that latch from the roof all the way down and prevent it from collapsing. These buildings have no such defences. They're made of thin concrete, brick or wood, and so they collapse very easily after an earthquake. So the main factor here that affects hazard risk is how developed or how rich a country is. High-income countries, HICs, such as Japan, have lower hazard risk because people are less likely to be affected by an earthquake when it happens. An LIC, such as Haiti, has higher hazard risk because people are more likely to be affected by a hazard, even if it's a similar hazard. But it's not just the level of wealth of a country, how rich it is. It's also where people are. This is India, both these photos. This is a city called Calcutta, and this is a place in rural India in the countryside. If an earthquake struck both of these places, which do you think would be more affected? Well, it would be the city, Calcutta, that would be far more affected. Why? Because there are far more people packed into a small area. There are also far more buildings under which people can be trapped in an earthquake. And consequently, when you have a difference in population density, which is the amount of people in a certain area, you affect hazard risk. Areas with high population densities, such as cities, have a higher hazard risk because people can't escape, more people are likely to die because of collapsing infrastructure, more people are likely to be homeless or get disease. If you live in rural areas, the countryside, such as here in India, and there's an earthquake, you're not going to be affected directly. There are few buildings to collapse, there are few people to die beneath them. And so population density is an important factor deciding hazard risk. What about this? On the left, these people are preparing for a hurricane. And on the right, this place has been hit by a tsunami. Now, what's the difference? Well, it's easier to predict hurricanes, and we have a longer time before they occur to prepare for them. And so these people, having heard on the news that a hurricane is coming, have had time to board up their windows and gather supplies and make sure they have no loose objects in the streets or in their garden that can fly and damage them or their homes. Whereas here, although there was a warning, they had much less time, and the tsunami that came in destroyed an enormous amount of land and livelihoods on the coast. The type of hazard is so important in determining hazard risk. Some hazards affect people much more than others. Volcanoes typically affect far fewer people because there aren't many people living near them. Similarly, hurricanes often cause less death than do tsunamis because they are more predictable. We know where they're going to be, and so we can prepare for them. Earthquakes, in contrast to hurricanes, are the least predictable hazard. They can occur at any time. We have very little warning, and so we find it difficult to prepare. And so the type of hazard is another important factor. At this point, I would suggest that you either create a subtitle like this or a spider diagram middle. And then around each of these three spider branches or subtitles, add the key features and differences between areas that increase or decrease their hazard risk. So for example, you could say HIC versus LIC and say how they have different hazard risk and why. You could say how some hazards may be more powerful or less powerful. Some hazards may affect a much larger area. For instance, a landslide affects a much smaller area than a hurricane. Additionally, a volcano's lava is slow moving, so easily avoided, whereas an earthquake is not easily avoided at all. Some hazards are more predictable than others, and you may also talk about population density and how that affects hazard risk. So I strongly recommend you make notes around this kind of spider diagram or beneath subtitles. Time to assess learning. I'm going to ask you some questions. Write down your answers and then we will discuss them and check if you got them right. Question 1. Why do you think many people die long after a hazard has gone in poorer countries, for example, after the earthquake in Haiti? It wasn't just the collapsing buildings that killed people. So why do you think it is? Well, you should have said that earthquakes destroy all the infrastructure and buildings and services that we need to be able to survive. They destroy supermarkets and farms and roads, and so they prevent us from being able to gain access to food and medicine and healthcare if we're injured. And so even if we survived the earthquake itself, we might die from hunger, or from conflict, violence as people fight over food, or from a lack of medical care. Question 2. How does population density affect hazard risk? For example, with relation to earthquakes or hurricanes. You should have said that population density determines how many people die from a natural hazard. If you have high population density, that usually means that more people will die or be injured, because there are more people to be trapped underneath a building or to drown in a flood. Low population density usually means much fewer people are affected by a natural hazard. Okay, time to embed learning. I'm going to show you some questions. Answer them using your understanding and then mark your answers. Go for it. So number 1. You should have had any of these points. Question 2. How does the time of day of an earthquake affect the death toll? You could have said any of these points here. Really important to think about that. In future lessons we're going to explore earthquake case studies, so examples from around the world, and you'll see why time of day matters. Give yourselves a mark out of 4. If you got 3 or more, fantastic. Answer these questions. So the main natural hazards you should have said are earthquakes, volcanoes, storms, and these fall into 3 categories. There are 3 types. The first type is a natural hazard that is to do with the ground and what goes on underground. These are called geological hazards, that's to do with the rocks. So, earthquakes and volcanoes. You should have also said that there are atmospheric hazards, things to do with the atmosphere, the air. So, storms. And then finally you should have said there are hydrological hazards to do with water. So, floods. And 3 ways in which people are affected. You could have had any ways that you could think of. Loss of income from business, death, injury, homelessness, illness, depression. Many, many different ways people can be affected. In this topic, we're going to explore the ways that people are affected by natural hazards and what we can do to reduce it. Join me then.